Hey, thank you. Good morning. You might have noticed I was not at the beer fest last night. I actually flew in late last night from Boston, so it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for actually waking up. I appreciate that. I mean, if I have to do it, you have to do it. So I want to talk about what I think are some big changes coming to our industry, and how I see security evolving in the next few years, and how that's going to affect technology, policy, a bunch of things that we hold as true that are, I guess, not going to be true anymore, and how that changes. So a lot of this is the Internet of Things, but it really is cyber-physical systems in general. And I think it's a new way we have to start thinking about how computers work. So there's a Mark Andreessen in 2011, I think it was a Wall Street Journal essay. He said that software is eating the world. For 2011, that actually, I thought, a little bit ambitious. But today, software is eating the world. And sort of more explicitly, we're creating a world where everything is a computer. Right? We used to have things, then we have things with computers in them, now we have computers that do things. Right? So your smartphone is actually a small portable computer that happens to make phone calls. Your refrigerator is a computer that keeps things cold, and your microwave oven is a computer that makes things hot, and an ATM machine is a computer with money inside. Your car is a computer with 4 wheels and an engine. Actually, that's not entirely true. Your car is a 100-plus computer distributed system with 4 wheels and an engine. And this transformation is happening really at all levels of our lives. Right? So we wear computers, fitness trackers, medical devices. We basically wear our smartphones. Our homes have smart appliances, smart thermostats. We've read about Amazon and their smart door lock, and all of the other sort of smart home things. At work, various smart systems in either as part of the building you work in, right? Smart elevators, smart environmental control systems, and different smart business systems, CCTV cameras and other things. You read about smart cities where we're going to put sensors in roads and street lights and highways to collect information, smart energy grids, smart transportation networks. I mean, really a nuclear power plant is a computer that produces energy. So this is actually more than the Internet, right? This is different. It's the Internet of Things, but it's also more than that. So when I think about the Internet of Things, I think of it in 3 basic parts. I think of the sensors that collect data about us and our environment. Right? So these devices we're all carrying know our location. Right? They know everybody's in this room. And it's not nefarious. They just can't ring otherwise. Smart light bulbs, smart thermostats, smart highway sensors, they're collecting data. Right? So that we're censoring our world with all of these things. That's the first part. The second are the sort of the smarts that figures out what the data means and what to do based on it. And that includes processing, memory, and networking. And all of these sensors are connected. And oddly, a lot of the processing happens in the cloud. Not something we would expect with Moore's law making computers and processing cheaper and cheaper. I think it's surprising that the Samsung smart television, which listens to your voice commands, takes that raw recorded voice, ships it into the cloud for speech-to-text processing, and then ships the result back. That it turns out that's a more efficient way of doing that than doing the processing on the television itself, even though it probably has more computing power than the space shuttle. So that's the second part. The third part are the actuators that affect our environment. The whole point of the smart thermostat in my home is to regulate the heat in my home. The whole point of a driverless car, or even a car that it still has a driver but has sensors, is to react to those sensors. Right now, for a lot of modern cars, it's impossible to drive headfirst into a wall. The sensor will detect the wall, the brakes will be automatically applied, right, regardless of what the driver's intentions are. So you can think of the sensors as the eyes and ears of the internet. You could think of the actuators as the hands and feet of the internet, giving the internet sensing capabilities and capabilities to do things. And that stuff in the middle as the brain. So we're creating an internet that senses, thinks, and acts. Now, that is the classical definition of a robot. And I think the way to think of this internet today is that we are building a robot the size of the world and don't even realize it. Now, we don't realize it because it's not a robot in the classical sense. We think of robots as discrete autonomous entities housed in a metal shell with the sensors and actuators on the surface. So Data from Star Trek or the Star Wars robots. That's what a robot looks like in our minds. This is different. It's a distributed robot. It doesn't have a central brain. Parts of it are controlled by different people. It doesn't have a singular goal or focus. And weirdly, it's not something we've deliberately designed. It's an emergent property of the internet we're building. And this has some pretty profound implications to security. It's a combination of sort of different technologies. You could talk about mobile computing, cloud computing, persistent computing, machine learning, informational databases, Internet of Things, autonomy, AI. But the way to think of it as smart things that affect the world in a direct physical manner. And what this all means is that internet security becomes everything security. You're starting to see this, right? Our expertise is suddenly valuable in the auto industry, and not because they have a computer network, because cars are now computers. Our expertise is now valuable in the consumer products industry, is now valuable everywhere. And all the lessons of our world become applicable everywhere. Vulnerabilities in patching, security and complexity, attackers and their tactics. It's exploding. And the threats are changing. So traditionally in our world, we tend to be concerned about privacy, confidentiality. There's data, and we need to make sure it isn't stolen, it isn't misused. That tends to be the bulk of our job. But the threats come in many forms. You've all heard about the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability. Those are the three basic types of threats. When you start moving into computers that affect the world in a direct physical manner, the availability and integrity threats become much worse. Because there's real risks to life and property. I mean, sure, we can imagine a computer-connected car, and there's a privacy threat that someone could hack the car and learn the car's location from the GPS. Traditional threat. It's a much bigger threat that someone can hack the car and disable the brakes, which is an availability threat. Or, change the navigation system, a data integrity threat. You start moving into driverless cars, vehicle-to-vehicle communication, and these threats become much greater. In a lot of ways, I don't care what the cars are saying to each other, as long as I know that data is accurate and hasn't been hacked. And so the same things, the same vulnerabilities we worry about have very different consequences. Right? There's a fundamental difference between a hacker crashes your computer and you lose your data, and a hacker crashes your car and you lose your life. It could be the same CPU, the same operating system, the same software, the same vulnerability, the same exploit, the same attack software, but with wildly different consequences. Right? And we're used to this. The threats are interlocking. Right? Back to the car. Right? We talked about an eavesdropping threat, where someone can learn, because someone can basically follow the car through hacking the GPS or some other navigational system. We read about hacking the microphone to eavesdrop on the car. But we also read about Volkswagen hacking the emissions control software to cheat on government tests. Right? We read about the police wanting the ability to remotely disable a car. I mean, it sounds like a good idea. We can eliminate high-speed chases. It feels like it'll make the world safer. But then I now have to think about, I don't want hackers to be able to remotely disable a car. And I surely don't want them to remotely disable every car. Right? And then these threats are going to become more catastrophic as the cars get more computerized and more autonomous. So I think a lot of our security paradigms are going to fail in this new world. So right now, our computers and phones, right, these devices, are as secure as they are for two basic reasons. One, there's a team of engineers at Apple, at Microsoft, at Google that are doing their best to design them secure in the first place. There's large security teams at these companies. And two, those teams are available to quickly and effectively deliver security patches to all these devices when a new vulnerability is discovered in the wild. Right? That is how we get security. We do our best to design them secure. In reality, we do a mediocre job, so we have a very, very robust and strong patching system. Right? That doesn't work for low-cost embedded systems like DVRs and home routers. Right? Those devices are cheaper, they're built at a much lower margin, they're often built offshore by third parties. They don't have security teams associated with them. People come together, build it, and disband. Even worse, many of these devices have no way to patch their software and firmware. I mean, right now, the way to update your home router is to throw it away and buy a new one. That is the upgrade path. In some of them, there is a patching mechanism. Don't even try it. You have a DVR, there isn't a patching mechanism. There actually is no way to patch it. We also get our security from the fact that we churn these devices. Right? Every 2 to 3 years, we're buying new phones, new laptops. And you know this, especially with the iPhone. The security gets better with each respective version. My computers too. This isn't true for our embedded systems. Now, you replace your DVR every 5 to 10 years. You replace your refrigerator every 25 years. You probably expect to replace your home thermostat approximately never. And the market really can't fix this because in most cases, neither the buyer nor the seller care. Right? The buyer wants a cheap device that works. Often the vulnerabilities attack third parties, and it's an externality. So right now, your DVR could have been part of the Mirai botnet. It could be part of this new Reaper botnet that's using many of the same code from Mirai. That's amassing, I think it's up to 2 million devices right now. Right? your DVR could be part of that. One, you have no way of knowing, and two, you kind of don't care. As long as it works as a DVR, it doesn't matter. And maybe we'll care in this room, but none of your friends care. Right? It's a DVR, it works, what's the problem? Right? And that's going to change how these things get fixed. Defending against the Reaper botnet is hard, because it's not just dropping a patch onto Windows and making the botnet go away. All right, so security is an arms race. I've been saying this for years. And technology perturbs this arms race. I want to talk quickly 5 truisms that affect the arms race on the internet that's going to affect it everywhere. Some of these you know, but I think it's worth going through them. 1, on the internet, attack is easier than defense. You all know this. I could talk about the reasons. Its complexity, its extensibility, all the reasons why it is easier to attack than defend. Second, most software is poorly written and insecure. Again, you know this. We don't want to pay for good software. We pay for cheap. We pay for features at the expense of quality. Right? Software is poorly written, full of bugs, full of vulnerabilities. Third truism, there's vulnerabilities as we connect things. Right? Vulnerabilities in one thing affect another. The Dyn botnet, vulnerabilities in DVRs and CCTV cameras and home routers allowed hackers to launch a massive DDoS attack against Dyn, which dropped a couple of dozen popular websites on the internet. And there's more and more of these. The Target breach. It was a vulnerability in the HVAC supplier for a few middle Pennsylvania Target stores that allowed the hackers to get in, move into the corporate network, move into the payments network. But you put things together and vulnerabilities affect each other. I think the neatest story, it's old now, Matt Honig, tech reporter, I think it was 2011. And he writes about an attack he personally suffered. And it's kind of neat to watch. It was a vulnerability in his Amazon account, allowed hackers to get into his Apple account, which allowed them to get into his Gmail account, which allowed them to take over his Twitter account. Next truism. The way attacks scale on the net is different. Right? Everyone has to stop the best attackers in the world. Right? The notion that attacks are limited by expertise, which is mostly true in the real world, doesn't apply on the internet because of software. So you have the person who wrote the Mirai botnet making his code public, and within a week, that code's in a couple of dozen botnets. Right? Someone invents a new attack, promulgates it. Right? The NSA has a really fantastic attack tool. It's stolen by the Russians, it's published by the shadow brokers, and within a month, North Korea is using it to launch cyber attacks. Right? The notion of class breaks, of scaling, these are things we are used to that the real world is not. And they're used to, cars. Cars fail in some rate throughout the year. In our world, all the cars work great until one day when none of them do. It's a different way of looking at security, of failures that we're used to that no one else is. The last trend is there's a perverse result of copyright law makes it very hard to conduct security research on these real-world systems. In the United States, it's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. There's a parallel in Canada. I forget the name. Cory Doctorow, who's actually Canadian, writes about it. Right? And this is a law that is designed to protect copyright works, but contains rules against reverse engineering, effectively that prohibits security research. So we often have a lot of trouble figuring out where the flaws are in these systems because the research can be, in some cases, criminalized. Even in cases where it's not, we're seeing less research done by academics, by freelancers, simply because these laws put a shadow on it. So these are some things about sort of our world that are soon going to be true everywhere. So in general, there are two basic paradigms of security. There's paradigm A, which is secure it well and properly the first time. And this comes from the world of dangerous things: planes, automobiles, medical devices, buildings. And this is security by design, this is secure engineering, this is security testing, it's certifications, right? Certification of products, of engineers. And there's paradigm B, which is make sure your security is agile. And this comes from the rapid moving and heretofore benign world of software. And this is rapid prototyping and update. This is the patching I talked about, survivability, recoverability, mitigation, adaptability. Now, these two paradigms are colliding in our cars, medical devices, traffic control systems, voting machines. And we need to figure out how to make these paradigms work together. It's actually hard. Right? So Windows XP, a 13-year-old operating system that's no longer supported by Microsoft, is still running something like 95% of all ATM machines. And medical systems had a problem, and it's still in some countries, that they get certified and then they can't be patched because the patching obviates the certification and they go through the process again. This is certainly true with voting machines in many states in the United States. Don't know about the rest of the world. But the certification process is so onerous, and then once something is certified, it can't be modified. 2015, Chrysler recalled 1.4 million cars to fix a software vulnerability. The cars had to be driven back to a dealership or an authorized service center to get a software patch. Compare that to Tesla, which remotely sends security patches to all cars, and they get automatically installed overnight. Earlier this year, there was an embedded heart defibrillator that needed a security patch that required going back to a doctor. It did not require opening up the patient, which would have been even worse. Now, we're still trying to get this to work. How do I square doing it right the first time from this world of do it and never change it, and our world of change it all the time because new vulnerabilities appear all the time? So I think the change that's going to happen is government involvement. But the big change that's coming to our industry is that government's going to get involved in a big way. As we start moving computers into automobiles, medical devices, consumer devices, we're going into worlds that are already regulated. And computers and software, which has largely been regulation-free, that's going to disappear. And I actually think that's a good thing and something we need to embrace and get ahead of. The problem is we really don't have a regulatory structure in pretty much any country that can tackle this at a systemic level. Because there's a fundamental mismatch between the way computers work and the way government works. Or let's say between the way computers work and the way technology used to work. Right? Governments and technology used to work in silos. So right now, there'll be one agency that regulates aircraft. Another agency regulates medical devices. A third agency regulates automobiles. A fourth agency regulates consumer devices. Right? So things are separate, and jurisdiction changes based on how data is used. So again, if you think about the United States, you have the same database. If it's being used in a financial context as one agency, it's being used in an election context as another. If it's being used in a context of education, it's a third. If it's being used for advertising, it's a fourth agency. We have a whole where systems that really don't have the ability to have notice and consent fall through. Right, so in the United States, right now, if I was to build a drone that would lock on to the MAC address emanating from your smartphone, follow you around videotaping you, there kind of isn't any way to regulate that because it falls through everybody's cracks. And thinking ahead to robotics, there's going to be a lot more issues as these devices start moving around our world on their own. I mean, I think when we start thinking about driverless cars, it's not driverless cars that are going to be the thing. It's going to be driverless everything else. Because that automatic pizza delivery driverless car is not going to be a car. It's going to be a pizza box on wheels. And it's going to be this big. And it might be working on the sidewalk and not in the streets. There's all sorts of new things happening. Already right now, there's an app on this phone that logs my health information, controls my energy use, and communicates with my car. So that's 4 different regulatory agencies in the United States. Right? And this is just getting started. My feeling is that we need some way to capture that these things are all computers. Whether they are cars or planes or boats or telephones, they are computers first and whatever else second. So we need some kind of holistic solution. And my thinking is that we are going to move towards some new government agency. There will be some new regulatory agency that will deal with this. Now, I know we are living very much in a low trust in government environment, but there's a lot of precedent for this. In the 20th century, new technologies led to the formation of new government agencies all the time. Now, again, I'm speaking for the United States, but trains did, cars did, airplanes did, vaccines did. I mean, that's how we got the CDC, with Center for Disease Control. Right? Radio led to the formation of the Federal Radio Commission, which became the Federal Communications System. I'll bet you anything Canada followed a similar path. Right? Nuclear power in the United States led to the formation of the Department of Energy. Right? Again and again, new technologies need new expertise, need new ways of thinking about government's role in these technologies, lead to the formation of new government agencies. Because there are a lot of problems here that markets can't solve. There are market failures in IT security. Markets tend to be short-term, profit-motivated. They work at the expense of society. They cannot solve collective action problems, which are everywhere in our industry. And we actually do need some counterbalancing force of corporate power. You know, we in the United States are going through a very large soul-searching about the power of sites like Facebook. And there is no counterbalancing balance to that. And government is how we solve problems like this. Right? You know, saying this in the United States, I get a very negative reception. I tend to think of Canada as much more government-friendly as an understanding how government works in the public interest as opposed to works against the public interest. You know, more aligned with the way I think Europe thinks about this. So I actually don't expect the United States to lead in this. I expect countries like the EU, Korea, Japan, Canada to do this much faster. I mean, we can make lists of regulations we need. I mean, sort of pretty much anyone can do it. For IoT, testing, patching, secure defaults, support for research, interoperability, data security, data portability, right? Some ability to operate without the internet, some sort of liabilities. I mean, yes, there are going to be lots of problems. We can, all know the problems of regulation. But I'm not convinced there's any alternative. I mean, to me, governments are going to get involved regardless because the risks are too great and the stakes are too high. Governments are already involved in physical systems. And when the internet actually starts killing people, there will be a call for action. And nothing motivates the government like fear. Right? In the United States, you saw a very anti-government administration form a new government agency within a year after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. It was an amazing show of increased bureaucracy, born entirely out of fear. And I worry that same sort of thing will happen to our industry. And I think our choice is no longer between government involvement and no government involvement. It's between smart government involvement and stupid government involvement. So we need to start thinking about these things. Otherwise, this will be done to us. Which leads me to, I think, my final point. As technologists, we need to get involved in policy. The Internet of Things is going to bring enormous potential, but also enormous risks. We've talked about some of them. But as Internet security becomes everything security, Internet security technology becomes more important to overall security policy. All of the security policy issues will have strong technological components. And you'll see it in the debates. And we'll never get the policy right if the policymakers get the technology wrong. Right? United States, the UK, even in Canada, there's this going dark debate. Should manufacturers be forced to put backdoors in their encryption products to satisfy law enforcement? That is a policy issue with a very strong technological component. And a lot of the people, I think, on the wrong sides of this issue don't understand the technology. The vulnerability equities debate, again, United States, Europe, lots of countries. What do we do about governments stockpiling computer vulnerabilities for offensive use? Yes, that is strong policy, but that must be informed by technology. Voting machines, driverless cars, all of these issues. And we need to fix this. Sadly, it is our job to fix this. Technologists need to get involved in policy discussions. We have to be in the offices of legislators. We need to be in federal agencies, at NGOs, part of the press, right? In companies working on policy. Either we get involved or this is just going to be done to us. And I think that would be worse. So thank you. So I deliberately left a bunch of time for questions. Rumor is that there are microphones on stands places, which I can't see them, but I assume they're there. But if you line up in front of them, I will know where they are. Oh, I see one of them. And then I will call on people. And I saw my first question over there.
Good morning.
Good morning. That's not a question.
It is not. So you talk about how government regulation could get involved. Do you see a role for organizations like professional engineers being part of that regulation and actually understanding how, just like if I build a bridge, it needs to be built in a way that's safe for consumers. I don't need to sign consent every time I cross a bridge, that computers should be built the same way.
I think there is a huge role there, and looking at other engineering disciplines, I think, is the right place to look. That engineers are certified, they have license, they have to sign off on plans to build bridges, they have responsibilities. And it seems crazy that I guess I'm back in the United States, because it's what I know the best, that you can't cut someone's hair for money in the United States without a license. You can write software that determines who gets let out on parole with no license at all. And my guess is some sort of licensing for software engineers is coming. The industry has resisted it, right? And some of it is the fact that we have just a huge demand, but there's going to be some level of software engineer that's going to require licensing. And that, will be government sanctioned, but it's going to be the professional organizations that do that. And I think that's going to happen within 5 years. I just can't imagine it not. Right? As this software gets into these critical components, there's going to be the same sort of engineering you see for people who design bridges. And I'm not convinced that's a bad thing. I mean, we need the whole ecosystem. We can't make it work until we have the universities training to these exams and these requirements. But I think that's coming. I'm going to go to that side.
Morning. Given that the internet's got no real boundaries, if we start to go to this idea of the US puts in regulations, Canada puts in regulations, we know that companies will just offshore it, move it somewhere else where the regulations don't apply. Do you think that this will end up being better served or eventually lead to like a United Nations style internet governing body?
Yeah, it's interesting. My guess is you're going to have regulations at all levels. But yes, a lot of these problems are international. There are things that countries can do. Right? If the EU starts flexing its regulatory muscle with GDPR, they're a big enough market that they can move the needle everywhere. So unlike cars, so the car that's sold in Canada is a different car that's sold in Mexico, because the environmental regulations are different, and manufacturers build cars to the regulations. Software is very much a write once, use everywhere. The economies of scale are very different. It's actually more annoying to have two different builds of your software than one. So it's likely that the stringent regulations in the big markets become de facto everywhere. We're going to see this in action. Right? GDPR goes into force in spring. It'll start being enforced. And we'll see what companies like Facebook do. Do they maintain differential privacy, depending on who you are, or do they have some sort of baseline? We see some of this in toys. Europe is trying to regulate internet consumer products. And companies are fixing the vulnerabilities, but they just sell that new version everywhere. Yes, though, I think we're going to need some sort of international cooperation. This is going to be hard. I mean, I think of all the other international problems where you have that kind of leakage. I think of money laundering or small arms trafficking, where international cooperation is spotty. It makes things better. There are still havens for abuse, but things do get better. So, this is a hard problem, but I think there are solutions in the international community and in the domestic community. My main worry is that we're going to get heavy-handed international regulations. I mean, right now, a lot of the international regulatory bodies are trying to be co-opted by the more authoritarian governments as ways to push their agenda. Right, so anything we do for security in United States, Canada, and Europe, we need to be okay with also happening in Russia and China. Person in the middle.
Yeah. Bruce, the idea of internet as a robot was just fascinating. But the robot is one entity. All the sensors are going to go through single thought process, and actuators that are going to go do cohesive action. Would you agree that we might have created many robots?
Yeah, I mean,
and if it is many,
yeah. I mean,
how would you call it? Society, school, swarm, set?
Yeah, I mean, that's my point. It is not a singular. I mean, it is a singular entity, but it is distributed. It's distributed in thought, in purpose, in action. It is not the robot we thought about. And this makes sense because we get our conceptions of the future from the present. Right? We get our definitions of robots from science fiction, movies, television, books. And they are written, from the present. You read robots in the 50s were different than robots in the 80s, or the robots in this decade. So the actual robots are going to be different. But yes, they are not singular. But they are connected. I mean, it really feels like one thing, even though it is distributed in purpose and focus and design and action. And what that means, I don't think anybody knows. And I don't even think we can predict what it means. I mean, nobody knows what a driverless car is going to look like. I mean, we know what it would look like to take a car of today and make it driverless. But the driverless car in 20 years, my guess is that the car, the object, will be just one component of a driverless car system. And the sensors that car is using, most of them won't be attached to the car. And the decision-making process probably won't be on the car. Some of it might. I mean, it might be all the cars together discussing among ourselves, how do we all get through this intersection as fast as possible? And you're going to have systems that effectively make no sense from today. But that's the way the future works. The question is, what can we do today in security to prepare for that? And that's kind of what I'm thinking about. I'm back over there.
Thank you. Sorry. How do you see the fact that, to some extent, we've been very successful as an industry, and we've permeated so many different facets of life? But when we look at regulation, all these individual agencies have their own power bases and their own self-interests. To what extent would a larger agency be able to control all that?
Yeah, I don't know. So this is where it's sort of out of my area of expertise. I mean, you're right that there's a lot of different equities in government. My feeling is that the expertise needs to be consolidated because it is all of a piece, that it's all about computers. Now, the industry has done great without regulation. I mean, it's very much a sort of libertarian ethos in Silicon Valley, in the tech industry. Leave us alone, we'll do great things. And that worked because it didn't actually matter. Right? That's why it worked. Because, it was email, it was Facebook, it was websites. Now it's physical things. And government's not going to stand by anymore. Yes, you could distribute the expertise. I mean, this is another way of thinking about it, right? Computers are permeating everything, so the expertise needs to permeate everything. I think more likely you're going to have some centralized control function. Is that the best way? I don't know. And then this is something I want technologists and policymakers to come together and think about. If we were to build this, right, we're going to start from scratch and build government that can effectively operate and regulate in the 21st century. What would that structure look like? And once we see that, then we could see what we want, where we are, if there's any path between the two. If there isn't, what's the closest we can get? We can start looking at what's realistic. I think we just need to start having these conversations. And I think we're not doing that at all. I think I'm going this way, yes.
Fair enough. When I think about, you talk about regulation, there's a lot of things that come into play with it, like there's licensing fees, and then you end up putting restrictions on software. And I mean, the concern obviously with us is that there's a lot of non-technical policymakers that make that decision, and how they apply the controls or whatever they want to implement into the software would be a concern. The other thing is there are things like open source software.
Right.
And regulating that, how does that impact the development or adoption of it in the enterprise?
Yeah, all important questions, and things we have to work through. I mean, you're right. If we have non-technical regulators, we're going to get lousy tech regulation. So how do we get technologists into this process? There are parallels to open source software in other industries. You know, what are they doing, and how is that working? You know, I'm just going to make one off the top of my head, that free software does, sort of by definition, doesn't come with any liability because it's free, but once a company sells it, it does. So I can imagine there's, people here create Linux, it's free, you can use it, but no liability is assumed. Or you can go through my new company, which is called, the Linux installing company. And what I do is I take this free software, because I'm a company, I sell it to you, but I'm also selling you liability protection. Now, I just made that up. Is that the way to do it? I have no idea. But there are ways to do it. But you're going to have to realize that, yes, there's going to become restrictions. That in the pharmaceutical industry, you just can't be a startup, make a new drug, sell to people, see what happens. If they die, patch it later. Right? You can't do that. You're not allowed. And when software has those effects, you're not going to be allowed to do it either. We might not like it because it was really fun when we could just all write software, put it out there, sell it, start companies, no rules. But now it's getting too dangerous. So whether we like it or not, that's going to change. And given that that is true, how do we get involved in the changes? Because of what you said in the beginning. Otherwise, it'll be non-technical regulators imposing a bunch of restrictions that don't make any sense, don't do good, harm, don't solve the problem. I mean, we've seen this in the past couple of decades with various laws trying to protect children on the internet, different computer crime laws. They've generally been lousy. How do we fix that? That's what I want to do. In the center.
I'm kind of asking the same question. You suggest, I think correctly, that we need to get technologists in the offices of the legislators. I think that is the issue. We have judges and lawyers who interpret law, who apply old law to new circumstances, and we don't have technologists in their office, and we can see how that works out.
Yep.
So how do we have success when it comes to law creation as opposed to law adjudication?
I think we do better because the ages are different. I know in the United States, I talk to legislators a lot, and their staffers are younger. So there's a lot more expertise in a legislative office than there is in a courtroom. Right? My father is a judge, right? And his technological savvy, all right, is not that great. And he's right. He's going to make judicial decisions based on analogies and things, that he thinks works that might not. I think we'll do better in regulatory agencies. We'll do better in legislative bodies. We'll do better in NGOs where you have a younger generation. I think you do get, the way it seems to work in courtrooms is while the judges tend to be older, the litigants on either side tend to be more savvy. So I think we'll get better outcomes there. I don't know. I mean, this is something that's going to take time. And I think you're pointing to a very important generation gap here between those who understand and those who don't. I mean, I think that's a problem we have right now in the United States with the FBI, that the FBI doesn't understand the equities involved in some of the backdoor things they're asking, less because of their age, but because of their very myopic focus on one aspect of the technology. That I need people above them to make a more nuanced equity decision. No, I'm not arguing that the issues you point out are real. See a question there.
Yeah, so I work in healthcare software, and so we're heavily regulated. You mentioned you're not a fan, or you mentioned some problems with certification. So one of the unique aspects of healthcare, in the US, HIPAA, the healthcare regulations, Canadian laws are similar. They are best effort. They're not certification. So you cannot get certified for HIPAA.
Right.
Although there is some move to try to push that. I actually think it's better not to. It's best effort. You can get audited, and when they audit you, then they decide if you're meeting the needs. Do you have any thoughts on the comparison between some model like that versus a certification model?
Yeah, my guess is best effort's going to work better in the near term for all the reasons you realize. It's a moving target, threats change, defenses change, attacks change, and anytime you make a rule, you must do this, it's obsolete pretty much as soon as you write it. That some sort of best effort evaluation makes more sense. I mean, one of the problems we're going to have, and I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon, is that technology moves faster than law. And that's relatively new. You go back 100 years, someone invents the telephone, and you could take a couple of decades to figure out the regulation as telephones permeate society. Law can move faster. Now, someone invents a home consumer drone, and before you can do anything, they're everywhere. And there's a lobbying group, and suddenly it's almost too late to regulate. That's not changing. So we need to figure out how to make law that is adaptive, that is agile in the same way software is. Right? So I'm going to give you a United States example. In the United States, we have two different rules about police accessing email. So normally when the police want your current email, they have to get a warrant. But email that is stored on a server more than 180 days can be accessed with a much lower standard with a subpoena. The reason was, back in the 90s, I think early 90s, maybe the 80s, when this law was passed, the way you would do your email is you'd go up to the server, get the email, download it to your computer, you'd read it and delete it. So email left on the server more than 180 days was considered abandoned. So it didn't have the same protections. Fast forward to today, email left on the server more than 180 days is everybody's Gmail account. Right? So technology changed, it flipped. But the law written for previous technology now makes no sense. And how do we deal with that? That's hard. How do we deal with the fact that movies used to be delivered on DVD and now they're streamed, and then the laws protecting change? How do we deal with the fact that correspondence, that communication, used to be mail, then it was email, then it became text messages, and now it's Facebook DMs, and in another 2 years it'll be something else? Now, how do I make it so the law is technologically invariant? And I don't know. But some of those ideas of best efforts and adapting to changing circumstances are going to be how we do it. Because otherwise, we're going to constantly have our stuff out of obsolete and out of date. All right, so I am out of time. I thank you very much. I am right now, I should tell you all, there's an IBM booth over there, and I'm going to be giving away and signing these. So I think we have like 250 of these books, and if you count yourselves up, you'll see there are more than that of you, so figure it out amongst yourselves. But I'm happy to talk more and say hi. Thank you very much.